Imagine pouring your heart, your savings, and your dreams into a home, only to wake up one morning and realize the very people who live around you want you gone. Every fine, every rule, every whispered complaint are not just rules but weapons, aimed at you because of the color of your skin. What would you do if your sanctuary turned into a battlefield and the system itself was stacked against you? How far would you go to fight a system designed to push you out? For Marlene Thompson, a 42-year-old widow and lifelong mechanic's daughter from the South, the nightmare didn't come overnight. It crept in like a shadow over her freshly painted porch, over her well-tended garden, and over the quiet streets of Cedar Heights, the neighborhood she had once believed would be her sanctuary. She had purchased her home 5 years ago, a modest but sturdy brick house sitting on a corner lot, a little over 2 acres that backed onto a small, wooded area. It wasn't the grand mansions her neighbors flaunted, but it was hers. She had worked tirelessly after her husband's sudden death 2 years prior to save every extra dollar, to ensure she could leave her daughter, Kayla, a stable, safe home. She had envisioned weekend barbecues, birthday parties, and quiet evenings under the stars. But that vision began to fracture the moment she joined the Cedar Heights Homeowners Association. Before we dive back in, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing the places my viewers call home. It's like building a map of this community, and who knows, you might even be closer to me than you think. It all started with subtle comments at the community pool. A neighbor, a white woman named Claudia, whispered about those people not understanding the neighborhood standards. Marlene smiled politely, hoping it was just a slip of the tongue, but the unease settled in her chest. Soon, letters arrived in the mail. First, a warning about a misaligned fence post. Then, a fine for unauthorized landscaping. Each letter was more aggressively worded than the last, citing rules that didn't even exist when she bought her property. Marlene tried to reason with the HOA board. She showed them deeds, city permits, and photographs. She walked into meetings with calm resolve, explaining that the fence had been installed correctly, that the landscaping was permitted, and that every step she had taken was in full compliance. Yet the fines kept coming. Every week, it seemed, another envelope would appear in her mailbox, stamped with the HOA seal, each letter threatening legal action, each one a reminder that she was, in their eyes, a problem to be solved. It wasn't just the fines. The HOA imposed arbitrary deadlines for maintenance she could not afford. They scheduled surprise inspections, nitpicking the smallest imperfections, a patch of untrimmed grass, a crack in the driveway, a paint color they deemed unsuitable. Friends who had once stopped by for coffee now gave nervous smiles, avoiding the topic as if acknowledging the harassment made them complicit. Her daughter, Kayla, only 10 at the time, began asking why other kids' parents looked at her strangely at school events, whispering about her yard and house problems. Marlene felt the sting of injustice not just for herself, but for her child. Every day, she would watch Kayla carefully adjust her school uniform, straighten her hair, and avoid speaking up, as if she could somehow make the neighborhood's hostility disappear. By the 3rd year, the fines had accumulated to over $50,000. Marlene had already sold her husband's tools and a portion of his motorcycle collection to keep up with the mounting fees. Each dollar she spent felt like a blow to her late husband's memory, a diminishment of everything they had worked for together. But Marlene was not a woman who backed down. She reached out to a lawyer, a black woman named Denise Williams, who had built a reputation for taking on systemic housing discrimination cases. Denise reviewed the HOA's bylaws and history and found what Marlene had suspected. There was a pattern. The HOA selectively enforced rules, disproportionately targeting properties owned by black residents. Other families had built similar fences, planted the same flower beds, and painted their houses in the same shades, but they received no fines, no warnings, no visits from the board. The tension in Cedar Heights reached a breaking point when Marlene received a certified letter summoning her to a board meeting. The HOA president, a sharply dressed white man in his late 50s named Richard Calloway, had requested her attendance to discuss ongoing compliance issues. Marlene prepared herself for the confrontation, but she could not have predicted the hostility she would face. The day of the meeting, Marlene arrived at the HOA clubhouse, A polished building with marble floors and chandeliers, a stark contrast to her modest home. She was greeted by the familiar, cold stares of the board members, the kind of stares that didn't just see her, but sized her up, questioned her right to be there. Claudia and her husband, Michael, sat front and center, whispering and smirking. Marlene held her head high, refusing to show fear, but inside, her heart pounded like a drum. The meeting began with Richard Calloway reading off a list of violations. One by one, he cited supposed infractions, his voice calm but sharp. The board members nodded in agreement, their expressions unreadable yet unyielding. Marlene listened silently, taking careful notes. When it was her turn to speak, she presented her evidence, her voice steady, yet laced with the weight of exhaustion and indignation. She detailed the permits, the photographs, the previous inspections, and her attempts to comply fully with the HOA's rules. Her words were met with cold laughter from Claudia. "Rules are rules," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "If you can't follow them, maybe this neighborhood isn't right for you." Marlene's blood boiled, but she held her composure. She had to. For Kayla. For herself. "This isn't about rules," she said firmly. "This is about discrimination, and I will not allow my family to be bullied out of our home." The room grew tense. Richard Calloway's face reddened, and for the first time, he seemed unsure. But the board sided with him, voting to escalate the fines further and threatening foreclosure if Marlene did not comply immediately. As she left the building, she felt a mixture of fear, anger, and resolve. The battle had begun, but she knew that to win, she would have to expose the injustice for everyone to see. That evening, Marlene sat on her porch, staring at the twinkling lights of her neighbors' mansions, feeling both isolated and defiant. Kayla came to sit beside her, holding her mother's hand. "Mom," she whispered, "do you think they'll make us leave?" Marlene tightened her grip, swallowing the lump in her throat. "They may try, baby, but we're not going anywhere. Not without a fight." And in that moment, beneath the quiet hum of Cedar Heights at night, a seed of rebellion was planted. Marlene knew the road ahead would be long, fraught with legal battles, personal attacks, and societal prejudice, but she also knew one truth. She had the right to stand her ground, and she would do everything in her power to protect her home and her daughter from a system designed to push them out. The days after the board meeting passed like a storm rolling over Cedar Heights. Marlene Thompson felt the weight of every unfair fine pressing down on her, like invisible hands clawing at her throat. Each letter, each email, each automated notice from the HOA was a reminder that the battle wasn't abstract. It was personal. And yet, deep down, a fire had been ignited, one that no late-night whisper or intimidating stare could extinguish. She started with small steps. She documented everything: photographs of her property, copies of permits, dated correspondences, and recordings of conversations with neighbors and HOA officials who had spoken down to her or made veiled threats. Her daughter Kayla watched quietly, occasionally glancing at her mother as if sensing the gravity of the situation. Marlene explained little, but her resolve was palpable. "We don't back down when people try to take what's ours," she said one night, her voice steady, though her hands shook slightly from the adrenaline and exhaustion of constant vigilance. Word of the HOA's relentless tactics began to spread among the few black families scattered in Cedar Heights. Some reached out quietly, sharing their own stories of fines and intimidation, hinting at a systemic pattern the HOA preferred to hide. Marlene realized she was not just fighting for her home, she was standing at the forefront of something much bigger. The injustice was not isolated, it was deliberate. And it had to be exposed. The turning point came when the HOA sent an official notice claiming that Marlene's driveway, which had been there for years and matched the neighborhood standards, was non-compliant with safety codes, and that she owed $12,000 immediately. The letter threatened lien placement and eventual foreclosure. She felt the familiar surge of anger, but this time it was accompanied by a sharp clarity. She wasn't going to play defense anymore. Marlene met with Denise Williams, the lawyer she had contacted months earlier. Denise was a powerhouse, tall, confident, and sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that demanded attention. She reviewed the mountain of documents Marlene had gathered. They're overreaching. They're selective. "And this can be proven," Denise said, her voice calm but resolute. "But we need more than paperwork. We need witnesses, testimonies, and evidence that clearly shows they target you because of race." That week, Marlene began knocking on doors. She spoke with other homeowners, quietly recording accounts of fines and inspections. Some neighbors were reluctant, fearful of retaliation. Others, quietly sympathetic, shared their experiences, acknowledging that the HOA's scrutiny fell heavier on certain families while leaving others untouched. Marlene documented every word, every hesitation, every glance that betrayed silent complicity. The next HOA meeting loomed, a special session convened to finalize compliance measures for Marlene's property. The board had not just escalated the fines. They had scheduled this session as a formal inquisition. Marlene knew attending would be dangerous, but she had prepared meticulously. She carried copies of her documentation, legal notices, photographs, and witness statements. The courthouse loomed like a monolith the morning Marlene Thompson first stepped onto its steps. Its cold, gray facade reflected the gravity of what lay inside, and she felt her chest tighten with a mix of dread and determination. Kayla clutched her mother's hand tightly, her small fingers a reminder of why Marlene was fighting. This wasn't just about asphalt and letters, about drives and lawns. It was about protecting her family, their dignity, and the principle that they could not be bullied out of their home simply because of the color of their skin. Marlene's lawyer, Denise Williams, had been relentless. For weeks, she had prepared meticulously depositions, affidavits, neighborhood testimonies, photographs, city permits, and an airtight chronology of the HOA's selective enforcement. Every detail was cross-checked, every loose end tied. Yet, as they entered the courthouse lobby, Marlene could see the skepticism in the faces around her, the jury pool, the clerks, even some attorneys, who whispered about another HOA dispute, as if the story of a black widow facing systematic harassment was ordinary. The hearing began with a procedural tone, but it didn't take long for the tension to spike. Richard Calloway and his board sat at the plaintiff's table, their postures smug, their whispers laced with confidence. Claudia and Michael's eyes darted toward Marlene whenever she passed, their judgment palpable. Every step she took seemed to disrupt the carefully curated narrative they had spun, one that painted her as difficult, non-compliant, and somehow out of place in Cedar Heights. Denise started with a clear, unwavering statement that cut through the courtroom's quiet murmurs. This case is not about trivial HOA rules. It is about deliberate targeting based on race. My client, Marlene Thompson, has complied with every regulation. The evidence will show a pattern of discrimination, intimidation, and selective enforcement aimed solely at her and other black families in the neighborhood. Gasps echoed. The board shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. For the first time, the arrogance that had shielded them for so long began to crack. Marlene felt her heart pound, but she held her ground, staring at Richard Calloway with a calm resolve that belied the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The first witness called was a longtime neighbor, Mr. Howard Jenkins, a white man who lived across the street from Marlene. He recounted incidents he had witnessed, the sudden inspections, the unfair fines, and the stark contrast between the treatment of Marlene and other homeowners. His voice trembled at first, but as he spoke, he grew more confident. I've seen my neighbors receive leniency for violations that were identical, or worse, to what Miss Thompson faced. And yet, she was harassed continuously, he said. Marlene glanced at Kayla, who was perched on a bench beside Denise, her eyes wide, her face a mixture of awe and relief. She squeezed her mother's hand under the table, silently conveying that she was proud, that she believed in the fight. The courtroom tension escalated when Denise presented documents showing city-approved permits, correspondence proving compliance, and detailed photographs illustrating that Marlene's property met and exceeded all HOA standards. She contrasted these with records of fines imposed on her for alleged violations that had never been enforced against other neighbors. The pattern was undeniable, a damning portrayal of systemic bias masquerading as authority. Richard Calloway rose, his voice tight and defensive. The HOA's authority is clear. Ms. Thompson has repeatedly violated neighborhood codes. This board has acted in accordance with regulations, and any claims of discrimination are unfounded. But Denise was ready. She presented statements from other black families in the neighborhood, people who had faced intimidation, threats, and excessive fines. She read aloud excerpts from letters that were harsh, threatening, and often inconsistent with HOA regulations. The judge's eyebrows raised slightly as she laid bare the inconsistencies, the selective enforcement, and the unmistakable pattern of harassment. Marlene's mind raced, remembering the endless nights she had spent gathering evidence, recording conversations, and meticulously cataloging every unfair notice. The courtroom, once intimidating and alien, felt like a battleground she had been trained for in secret. Every step she had taken to document the truth, every ounce of courage she had mustered, was coming together in this fight for justice. The first few days of the trial were grueling. The board attempted to undermine her credibility, casting her as combative and uncooperative. Witnesses were cross-examined with aggressive precision, and Marlene endured their glances and murmurs, their thinly veiled contempt. Yet, for every attempt to intimidate her, Marlene responded with calm logic and clear evidence. Her arguments were not fueled by anger, they were fueled by truth. Then came the turning point. Denise called a former HOA board member, someone who had resigned amidst controversy and harbored first-hand knowledge of the board's internal discussions. Her testimony was explosive. She described meetings where the board explicitly discussed targeting Marlene, citing her race and widowhood as reasons to apply pressure. They believed she wouldn't fight back, that her presence would be inconvenient to the image of the neighborhood, she testified, her voice steady and filled with indignation. A hush fell over the courtroom. The board members shifted uncomfortably, whispers passing between them, eyes darting nervously. Claudia's smirk faltered, Michael's jaw tightened, and even Richard's composure wavered for the first time. Marlene felt the weight of vindication, but she knew better than to relax. The fight was far from over. The courtroom drama was heightened by the presence of media coverage. Local news reporters had begun to pick up the story, intrigued by the conflict between a black widow and an all-white HOA imposing fines with aggressive precision. Headlines hinted at systemic injustice, framing Marlene not just as a homeowner fighting fines, but as a symbol of resilience against an institution that thrived on control and exclusion. Days turned into weeks, each session a marathon of evidence presentation, cross-examinations, and witness testimonies. The tension was suffocating, the stakes monumental. Marlene's nights were restless, filled with anticipation and anxiety, yet each day fortified her determination. She was no longer a passive victim. She was a warrior armed with truth, supported by her daughter, her lawyer, and a growing awareness within the community that justice was worth demanding. As the trial neared its peak, Marlene's evidence had begun to sway public opinion, turning the tide in subtle but powerful ways. Neighbors who had once avoided confrontation now whispered their support. Some reached out privately, offering statements, photographs, and testimonies that would strengthen her case. The narrative was shifting. What had begun as an isolated fight for property had blossomed into a larger struggle against systemic intimidation and racial bias. The climax of this chapter arrived when Denise presented a key piece of evidence. Recorded conversations between HOA members discussing the need to make an example of Marlene, explicitly acknowledging that their actions were influenced by her race. The courtroom erupted in whispers, disbelief, and murmurs of outrage. Marlene's pulse pounded in her ears, but she remained composed. She had fought too long, endured too much, to falter now. The judge called for a brief recess, and Marlene stepped outside, inhaling deeply. The weight of the courtroom, the judgment of strangers, and the scrutiny of the public pressed down on her, but she felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time, she realized that her fight had moved beyond Cedar Heights. It was a statement about fairness, equality, and the courage to stand against prejudice. As she held Kayla close, Marlene whispered, "This is just the beginning. They thought they could scare us into silence, but they underestimated what we're capable of." The courtroom doors closed behind them, the echoes of testimonies lingering in the air. Marlene knew the next sessions would determine the outcome of her battle. She also knew that the fight was bigger than fines, bigger than a driveway, bigger than Cedar Heights itself. This was a fight for dignity, justice, and the unshakable truth that she would not be pushed out because of who she was. The storm had only begun, and Marlene Thompson was ready to face it head-on. The courtroom was charged with electricity that morning, the kind that makes your skin tingle and your stomach knot in anticipation. Marlene Thompson sat in her chair, poised but alert, her hands clasped tightly around the edge of the table. Kayla sat beside her, her small frame trembling slightly under the pressure, but her eyes were wide with pride and trust. Every fiber of Marlene's being was attuned to what was about to unfold. The next few hours could change everything. The HOA board had shifted strategies. Their lawyers were sharper now, less patronizing and more aggressive. They had realized that simple intimidation would not work. Marlene was no longer a passive target. She had documented every violation, every unfair notice, every whisper and maneuver. They had underestimated her resolve, and now they were digging in. Their goal was clear: discredit Marlene, cast doubt on her witnesses, and manufacture confusion that might tilt the jury in their favor. The day began with cross-examinations that were relentless. Richard Calloway, who had been stoic for the past few weeks, now leaned forward in the witness box, eyes narrowing as he attempted to make Marlene appear unreasonable, combative, and out of step with neighborhood norms. Ms. Thompson has caused significant disruption, he asserted, voice low and measured. Her complaints have wasted the HOA's time and resources. Surely, you can see why we acted as we did. Marlene's lips pressed into a thin line. Every fiber of her body wanted to respond immediately, to defend herself, but Denise had trained her to remain calm, to let the evidence speak louder than any words. She focused on her breathing, her heartbeat, and the faces in the jury. They were listening, judging, not yet swayed, but listening. Then came the moment that would shift the momentum in her favor. Denise called for the HOA's internal emails to be read aloud in court. The room fell silent as excerpts exposed the board's intentions, the discussions about Marlene's race and widowhood, and their open frustration that she dared to challenge their authority. "We need to make an example," one line read. "She won't fight back, but if she does, we must intimidate further." The murmurs grew louder. Richard's jaw clenched visibly, Claudia's eyes darted nervously, and Michael looked down, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what was unfolding. Marlene's stomach clenched with a mix of fear and hope. The proof was undeniable. Her perseverance had unearthed the truth, and now it was being laid bare for all to see. Yet, the trial was far from over, and the tension tightened like a noose around the room. The next few days were a whirlwind of testimonies, forensic financial analyses, and neighborhood accounts. Denise had meticulously prepared evidence showing how the fines and arbitrary rules had financially burdened Marlene, threatening to push her from her home and erode her generational wealth. Witness after witness corroborated the narrative: selective enforcement, aggressive harassment, and racial bias at the core of the HOA's decisions. Each piece of evidence was a nail. As the day drew to a close, the judge recessed with instructions for the jury to deliberate. Marlene stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on her shoulders. She felt exhaustion, yes, but also an unfamiliar sense of hope. She had fought, and for the first time, the scales were beginning to tip. The neighborhood outside the courthouse was buzzing with whispers. Reporters and onlookers had gathered, curious about the high-profile case of a black widow challenging an all-white HOA. Marlene noticed a few neighbors watching from across the street, their expressions a mix of admiration, surprise, and perhaps a newfound awareness of the injustice she had endured. Marlene looked down at Kayla, whose eyes were bright with anticipation. "We've done everything we could," she said softly. "Now it's in their hands. But no matter what happens, we've shown them that we won't be silenced. That truth matters. That justice matters." As they walked back to their car, a sense of unease lingered, because even though evidence had shifted the momentum, the board would not give up easily. There would be appeals, there would be delays, and there would be attempts to undermine their progress. But for the first time in months, Marlene felt the possibility of victory, and with it, a flicker of empowerment that she had almost forgotten existed. The final scene of the day set up a chilling cliffhanger. As Marlene reached for the car door, her phone buzzed with an anonymous message. "You think you've won? This is only the beginning." The weight of those words sank into her chest. The courtroom had been a battle, but the war was far from over. She glanced at Kayla, who squeezed her hand in silent reassurance, and Marlene felt a renewed determination. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and she was no longer alone, no longer powerless. The fight for justice had reached its most intense moment yet, and the story of Marlene Thompson was far from finished. The morning of the final verdict arrived like a storm on the horizon, charged, heavy, impossible to ignore. Marlene Thompson sat in the courtroom, shoulders squared, Kayla's hand tightly in hers, the weight of weeks of struggle pressing down but somehow grounding her. This was the moment that had consumed her life, the culmination of months of harassment, sleepless nights, and battles that went far beyond her own property. This was not just a fight for a driveway, a fence, or a mailbox. It was a fight for dignity, for fairness, for the right to live in the home she had earned and deserved. The jury filed back into the room, faces unreadable. Marlene could feel the tension coil around her chest, each heartbeat echoing in the quiet that had fallen over the courtroom. Her eyes met Denise's across the room. There was a silent understanding there, a trust that they had done everything possible to expose the truth. The financial records, the emails, the witness testimonies, the meticulous documentation of each discriminatory fine, every piece had been laid bare. Now it was time for the law to speak. The judge cleared his throat, and the room seemed to shrink around them. "Members of the jury," he began, "have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, hand trembling slightly, voice steady despite the emotion that crackled in the room. "We have, Your Honor." Marlene's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to inhale slowly, to keep her composure. Kayla leaned into her, eyes wide, and whispered, "We did it, Mom. We fought all the way." The foreperson continued, "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Marlene Thompson. The Homeowners Association is hereby found guilty of discriminatory practices and harassment, and damages are awarded to Ms. Thompson." For a moment, time seemed suspended. Marlene felt the weight of every unfair notice, every threat, every whispered warning from the board, lift slightly off her shoulders. Her chest heaved with relief, but also with anger, the anger of knowing that for years, countless families had faced similar injustice with no one to stand for them. She looked at the HOA board members. Richard Calloway's smug expression had been replaced with stunned disbelief, Claudia's lips pressed tightly together, and Michael's eyes avoided hers. Their power had been dismantled, not with rage, not with threats, but with truth, courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The courtroom erupted in controlled murmurs. Some neighbors who had her eyes scanned the room one last time that night, taking in the walls that had been threatened, the garden that had been scrutinized, and the driveway that had been the battleground. This was more than a victory for property rights. It was a victory for dignity, for visibility, and for the acknowledgement that Black families, even in seemingly affluent communities, could assert their presence and claim their rightful place. Marlene whispered to herself, "We fought, we endured, and we won, but the fight isn't over. This story doesn't end here. It's a message to every family who's been told they don't belong." She looked at Kayla, who smiled, understanding in her young eyes what her mother had sacrificed, and what they had achieved together. "We belong," Marlene said softly, and the weight of those words settled over her like a promise. One truth was undeniable. Justice could be claimed, courage could be rewarded, and voices, even long silenced, could roar when given the chance. If you've been inspired by Marlene's story, take a stand in your own community, speak up, and protect what's yours. Kindly hit the like button for this video. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, resilience, and justice. Comment below to share your experiences. Together, we can amplify voices that deserve to be heard.